So it's basically going to talk about the issues that arise in terms of social justice when it intersects with art. Some issues as a creator you might experience as you decide to put your viewpoint into the world, and as you become more aware of social justice issues around art, what sometimes happens and how resistance comes up through that, and some ways of possibly, hopefully, combating that. So first off, I'm Allison Moon. If you're live tweeting, the hashtag here is BIL 2012, since we are privileged to be on the top floor of the web, you can actually get a signal probably. And I'm Tails of the Pack. That's my Twitter handle. So let's just start by defining some terms. First is radical. So radical means a change. To change something, to depart from something, to create something new. To define yourself as a radical, it usually means a commitment to that change, to creating active change in the world that is visible, that is able to actually instill something that is deep, that lasts, that transitions completely from the old model of something. Now, this is, in order to be radical, you have to be progressive. Progress implies the march forward of time. Radical is one step beyond progressive, in that radical means you're actually taking action to try and instill that change, often faster than the natural progress of things, if that makes sense. Now, the opposite of radical in this definition is fundamentalist. Fundamentalist is an idea that things were better way back when. There was an Eden that we fell from, and that we need to return to that, and every day we progress, we get farther away from what was perfect. So things are getting worse in the fundamentalist point of view. Things are getting better if we work forward in the radical point of view. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Cool. Yeah.
I mean, is it possible sometimes to be both? Or?
Possibly, but let's talk about that later. So now in terms of radical, it also means creating change. And so to create means to cause or create something to happen. And it again implies progress. The act of creation is changing the world. The act of change is a radical act. So to be creative is actually to align yourself with progressive ideas in at least some way. Not necessarily in the kind of highly politicized way we might think of the term progressive or the term radical, but in the idea of how we are affecting change in the world. So, how that applies to the creative personality. So the creative personality is this really hot issue around a lot of like forward-thinking groups of people. The idea that there are certain people that are just like born, ordained to be different, and they are privileged to see the world in a different way, and it kind of establishes this binary, right? It's that person's creative, that person's a free spirit, but all these other people over here, they're doing things the normal way. And that implies that there is some sort of value judgment around the creative personality, the person lucky enough to be born slightly insane, so that they can feel comfortable eschewing the modes of society versus the rest of us. And I'm really against that idea. I think creativity is not something that some people are just born lucky with. I think creativity is really a set of practical tools that people can instill in their lives regularly. And that's a completely different talk, but I do believe that that basically there's no such thing as people who are just like have the personality that enables them to be better at art than other people. However, that said, there are three things that I find to be kind of signposts around the creative personality that a lot of people kind of feel like are natural to them. So three things are alienation, anti-authoritarian, and people who tend to challenge or question the status quo. Now again, these things aren't necessarily you're born with them, these are often things that you grow up seeing. And the first one, alienation, is really the key for me in terms of the radical idea, in that alienation tends to lead to deconstruction. If you feel like you don't fit in, you suddenly start to question why not. What is everybody else doing that makes them feel comfortable in their skin or in the society that I don't have? So if you're poor, or if you're non-white, or if you're queer, or if you don't like school, these are things that kind of already set you up from the get-go, generally at a very young age, to be different. And that kind of instills a sense of dis-ease with the way society is built around you. For me, I realized I was queer in high school, which meant to me that in this society I couldn't get married. So if I couldn't get married, then what's marriage for, right? If I can't do it, then why are other people doing it? And if I don't want to get married, then what could I do instead? right? These are the questions that I could ask myself because I was privileged to be kind of different. I was privileged to realize that there was something else in my path that wasn't along the normal rule of things. So the deconstruction thing happens, and once you get good at it, you tend to do it a lot. Once you deconstruct things, you realize that there's other things to deconstruct. So if marriage wasn't an option, I wondered if I should be upset by it. If I did want marriage, should I try to get it or should I not? And I mean, there are plenty of people like me, there are plenty of like LGBT people who are fighting for the right to get married, and so some people want marriage and some people don't. And it becomes this kind of huge question of like, you're actually making questions around the fundamental ideas of what people take for granted, right? Now, the cool thing about this is that, you know, a lot of people never have to question it. You never have to question your identity if you are white in America. You don't have to question your identity if you're middle or upper class. These things are invisible to a lot of us because they are the status quo. Only when you are other do you realize that there's actually some sort of serious underpinnings of society that are actually designing the way that the world works. It's not just something that is the natural order of things. Somebody somewhere down the line made these rules happen, and other people fell in line with those rules, and that changes the way that we perceive things. You know, just like the women's liberation movement in the 60s and 70s did to illuminate that marriage was actually a choice, like you didn't have to get married, this was a really big radical idea for people, like really big and radical idea. The idea that you can be a single parent these days is because people were deconstructing this around you, right? And this is a beautiful thing, I think. This is the stuff that I really enjoy, because if you can start deconstructing ideas of, you know, interpersonal relationships, then you can start deconstructing ideas of gender. You can start deconstructing ideas of what relationships look like, what monogamy might look like. All these things are up for grabs when you start realizing that there are just these kind of arbitrary, or not so arbitrary, rules assigning meaning to these things. For instance, like my parents, both heterosexual, married, completely monogamous, completely in love, and everything in the script worked really well for them. They got good jobs, they worked really hard at those jobs, and then they got their pensions. They stayed married this whole time, and they never questioned any of it because it all worked for them. And then as they were raising my sister and I, they became concerned if we would make choices outside of the rules, because it would make life harder for us, which is a very like naturally parental thing to do. But for them, they saw it's kind of that idea of like, why be happy when you can be normal, right? The idea that if you fit in, then fit in. It's easier that way. Life will be better that way. But there's this whole world of people on the outside that think, well, A, you can't change your sexuality or your race or often your class, so is it your job to try and make yourself happy or fit in as normally as you can, or to create something better and bigger for yourself? And we all experience that in varying degrees in various ways, right? Your parents might want you to take over the family business, or they might want you to be a doctor, or whatever. There's all these rules that people try and tell you to do just to be normal, so that you can be happy. And that's kind of how the script goes. So again, like this for me, and for a lot of people that I know who are creative and radical, this is the good stuff. This is the fun stuff. We love deconstructing this. So like when you realize you have a choice, you get to act on those choices. If you realize that you don't have to be monogamous, you can actually make choices around what that actually looks like to you, what your family structure could look like. When you realize that you don't have to be straight, you can look at the world and what kind of relationships you would want to build, and this transcends into all aspects of your life. If you realize you don't have to have a normal job, you can become an entrepreneur and build your own business. And that's a really radical act for a lot of people, especially nowadays in a society, what's going on in society around entrepreneurship. People are realizing that the normal script of things actually kind of screwed a lot of people over. And now we're actually taking action into like, okay, so if that script doesn't work anymore, what can we do now? Which I think is really beautiful. So one thing that I like to talk about on this way is that when we start to see the mechanisms that are under the surface around a lot of these rules, we start to see where privilege exists. And privilege is a really interesting issue. I'm going to talk about it in the most broad way possible, because I think a lot of people have a lot of experience with dealing with privilege and understanding where their privileges are, where they aren't. And a lot of people, this is also a foreign concept. And I want to be very gentle with you about this, because it is really hard to be confronted with your privilege when you hadn't thought a lot about it. So I want to introduce you to an idea called the invisible backpack. Have any of you heard of the invisible backpack before? Okay, so it's from a paper by Peggy McIntosh called White Privilege, Unpacking the Invisible Backpack. So it's basically the idea that as you get to learn about the idea that society is actually in stratas, where you have people who are disadvantaged, right, in all sorts of different ways, class, race, education, all these things. So when you start to realize that there are people who are disadvantaged, most of the focus is on the disadvantages that those people have. Very little focus is on what that means that to the people who are actually over-advantaged. There are people who have more good things put on them that they never did anything to earn, just by being born in the right skin. That's privilege, okay? And so in this idea, the invisible backpack is essentially this thing that we carry around, and everybody's got different stuff in it, but we all have a different combination of things that make us privileged in society and disadvantaged in society. And the point of acknowledging this is realizing that this social strata isn't that some people are normal and other people are screwed. It's actually that some people are screwed and other people have got way more than they deserve, if that makes sense. So this is why it's very difficult to talk about a lot, because it does maybe make you notice things in your own life that make you feel bad. So I want to be gentle about this, but some of the examples, just to kind of illustrate this, is I'm going to go through about like 10 or 14 samples from this paper of things that are true, and this is from a race perspective, but this easily translates into gender or sexual orientation or religion or education. This stuff really does translate over. So just as I go through them, I'm going to read them out loud. Feel free to just answer in your head, like, is this true for me or not? So the first one. When I am told about our national heritage or civilization, I am shown that people of my color made it what it is. I can go into a supermarket and find the staple foods which fit my cultural traditions, or into a hair salon and find somebody who can cut my hair. I can go likewise find cosmetics and band-aids in flesh tones that generally match my coloring. I can swear, dress down, or speak in slang without having people attribute these choices to bad morals, poverty, or illiteracy of my race. If a cop pulls me over, I can be sure I haven't been singled out because of my race. I can turn on the TV or open the newspaper and find people of my race widely and positively represented. Obama did a lot to kind of change this a little bit, but he's still kind of the classic example of one person that gets to be on the front of the newspaper all the time when white people are widely represented positively. I can be pretty sure that if I ask to talk to the person in charge, I will face a person of my race. I am never asked to speak for all of the people of my racial group. I can speak in public to a powerful group without putting my race on trial, and I can do well in a challenging situation without being called a credit to my race. I can easily buy postcards, books, cards, dolls, toys, and magazines that feature people of my race. I can take a job without having coworkers suspect that I got it because of affirmative action. And these are a few of my own. Most people can easily pronounce my first name. I am not referred to as exotic or ethnic. People don't fetishize the traditional dress or sacred symbols of my culture. If I choose not to go to college or move up within my company, I'm not afraid that this choice will reflect poorly on the people of my race. And finally, I won't hear people dismiss my claims of discrimination saying that I imagined or misinterpreted it. So, again, this is a lot of information to swallow, especially if you've never really thought about this before. But these are really great illustrative, real-world examples of how one's perspective can shift when you're aware of all the underpinning societal rules that are focusing on improving one person's standing. The idea of going into a toy store and buying a doll doesn't seem like it should be a very confronting situation for most of us, but for a lot of people in this world it is. And we don't really notice that until it's kind of pressed in front of us. So it's really important just to realize that the backpack exists. Everybody's got different advantages, and yes, privilege is very contextual. You can go into a new world and encounter a completely different way of going about it. So for some really great examples of arguments that people have when they experience this kind of thing, Derailing for Dummies is a wonderful website that kind of lists all the stuff in terms of how you might derail this. When you are feeling confronted by somebody outing your privilege, it kind of lists a lot of the kind of knee-jerk reactions that people will have when they experience this. And these are two of my favorite. It's only the internet. You're being too sensitive. So the problem with privilege is that once you get it, you start seeing it everywhere. It's hard to watch movies or TV or read the newspaper without being like, oh, this is so raw, and it's really frustrating. Does anybody know what, it's hard to see on the screen, but does anybody know what stereotype is being represented here? No? The magical Negro, right. So we've got Bagger Vance, Green Mile, and of course Whoopi Goldberg in Ghost. These three magical black people who come to help save the day for white people. It's very common. So of course what happens is when you start noticing this is that you often will experience guilt. This happens again across all sorts of lines, race, gender, religion, whatever. Once people start to realize when you take credit for these invisible privileges, you can kind of like follow this rabbit hole down really far, and it can really shut you up. And that's what happens, that's what the big problem is around creativity. When it comes to resistance, you can, when you're trying to experience any sort of creativity, the easiest resistance is that you know, guilt will kind of shut you down, it will silence you, it will make you want to not speak, because whenever it becomes a zero-sum game, when you speak, you're taking away somebody else's voice in your head. And this is kind of white guilt in its most essential. And again, like it can be anything. We can feel guilty for who we are, what skin we were born in, but we can also feel guilty for what we have, a college education, a loving partner, a really awesome pet. I mean, these things can translate across boundaries. It's a pernicious enemy, and a lot of people suggest that guilt is worthless. I think a little bit of guilt is healthy, because it does illuminate those blind spots in our world. Is that a 1 minute, or is it a question?
Yes, no. At the beginning of this, you said an interesting phrase, which is some people are down and other people have more than they deserve.
Yeah.
And so one reason I don't feel so much the guilt you describe, despite being the white male, not thin, but that's good, is that I think everyone deserves what I've done.
Well, that's great, and I believe you. But I'm going to keep moving, and we can talk about that later.
No,
yeah, totally. So one thing a quote that I found when I was going through my own experience of white guilt, and I have a long, sordid story that I'll tell you if you actually care to hear it, but May Sarton is a fabulous author, and she said you finally have to give something terribly intimate and secret of yourself to the world and not care. Because you have to believe what you have to say is important enough. And it goes back to the idea that you have to believe that what you have to say matters. I silenced myself for a long time as a writer because I didn't believe that the world needed more white women speaking. Which is kind of ridiculous when you just like open your eyes and realize how few women are speaking in general, even here. So you see this, and I think it's really important for people to realize that the uniqueness of your voice is actually useful and will be the key to basically the radicalization of the world that you want to see. You have to give yourself permission to create. You have to give yourself permission. If you don't, you will shut yourself up before you even start. And then you will never find allyship, and you'll never actually be able to enact the change that you want to see in the world. So permission is the best way to get over guilt. It will help you kind of frame it as a duty is perfect. And that's one way to do it. But you have to do it for yourself. Nobody else can give you that permission. And another way of getting over this is to feed your head. Being aware of one's privilege is a really useful scenario because it will help illuminate blind spots. If you start to actively seek out voices from people who don't represent the kind of culture that you grew up in, if you start to actively seek out voices from people who believe different things than you, this is a wonderful way to actually start to embolden your worldview and actually stimulate your creative process, because you start to understand the outsiderness of completely different kinds of people. And your own alienation can find, mirrors and parallels in other people's alienation, which I think is really beautiful. So, in closing, I think the biggest issue the biggest fate that an artist can suffer, the worst thing that can happen to an artist isn't that they don't ever create, it's that they create things that are irrelevant. Being declared irrelevant is the death knell for an artist in so many ways. And so I think the key to being relevant and to create in a radical way is to illuminate all the dark parts and all the shadows that you don't actually see in your day-to-day life. And you can't erase privilege. That's, until we get to an equitable society, you will never erase privilege, and we can talk for days about whether that's even a good thing or not. But maintaining an ignorance of the way that the world works isn't going to help your art. It's not going to help you see things in a new way. It's only going to make your stuff more irrelevant as progress marches on without you. And I think that truly the idea of creation and the true essence of art is to find truth, and truth is very much about the multiplicity of different points of view, and I encourage you to, you know, feed your head in that way. So thank you. I will be here, so feel free to talk to me later, and if you have any questions, I want to get off the stage so we can get the next speaker up, but I'm happy to talk to you more about that later. So thank you.
Website.
Oh, and sorry, you can find me at talesofthepack.com. That's me. Thanks.
Woo!